Hello everyone. In today's video, I'm going to be trying something new, and I will be going over what a deed is, in the requirements of a deed, the types of a deed, or the types of deeds that you may see and come across, and mainly the three important types, and also what a deed is in relation to ownership of real estate. So with that being said, I'm Nicole, and let's begin. So to start, we're going to look at what a deed is. A deed is essentially a special written contract for conveying permanent interest in real estate. Now, what does that mean beyond the definition? What that means is that a deed is a specifically written contract that shows a proof of ownership, or more so a claim to ownership in a property. For those who don't know, interest is essentially a claim to ownership of some form, and real estate requires that you have a claim of ownership before you can express your rights to that piece of real estate, or as we call it, real property. So with that being said, what is a deed? Well, we already talked about how a deed requires conveying some form of interest, but the actual intricacies of a deed include many parts to convey the type of rights, to who, the type of property, as well as several other things that are important for properly conveying the interests of a deed. So with that being said, let's get into the different requirements that must be put into a deed. So the first main requirement, and arguably the most important part of a deed, is that it have a grantor and a grantee. Now, what does that mean? Well, a grantor is basically the person who is giving away the property, and a grantee is the person who is receiving the property. As you can tell, this is the most crucial part of having a deed, because we need to explain who gets what property in the process of shifting rights over from one person to another, or one entity to another. The first part, the grantor, is someone that has to be of legal age, must be legally competent, and must sign the deed. This is very similar to signing ownership, like a title for a car or a house, any other piece of ownership. The grantor has to be capable in understanding what they are doing with the property, and thus that is why they must meet these requirements. On the other side of it, the person receiving the property, the grantee, does not have to be any of these. In fact, the person doesn't even have to be alive when written in the deed, as the grantor can write in someone who hasn't even been born yet, say a great granddaughter, or a great grandchild just in general, or maybe even a brother that's about to be born. There's no limit on who can receive the property, and because of that, there's a larger window for rights to be conveyed and to be given away. And one quick note, when I say that it doesn't need to be identifiable, or the person who's the grantee only needs to be identifiable, what I mean by this is you can't just say a person. There has to be some kind of lineage or legal way to identify who is supposed to receive the land in question, which is why saying like a child can be proven, because you can prove that this person is related to you, or this person is your child. So that's just a quick note I wanted to say on identifiability. Now, the last part of mentioning a deed, I mentioned how there's a grantor and a grantee, and that's going to play an important part in this next part, a recital of consideration. Now, a recital of consideration is basically just considering the contract. And while it's a lot different from, say, buying a car where both sides have to agree to the contract, they have to agree to the payment, in real estate, that's not necessarily the case, because the grantee may not even be alive to understand and to accept and to consider, quote unquote, this great purchase or attainment of rights for this real estate that they are receiving. With that being said, though, in some states, a recital of consideration is required. And generally, no matter the cost of the land, a simple statement such as "for $10 and other good and valuable consideration" is said. And what this basically does is basically provide a, albeit not legitimate, but still legally valid reason for the conveyance of the property. The ultimate goal here is to provide some kind of demonstration that thought went into the disposition of rights to the real estate. All right, in this portion, we're going to talk about words of conveyance. Now, words of conveyance are a very, very important part of the deed, not just because they convey that the grantor actually wants to convey interest in the property, but it also determines what type of deed the deed in question is. We're going to talk about why this is important later, because the type of deed and its quality can determine both protection and liability of the grantor and grantee when battling off claims or claims that they don't have from other people to the real interest of the property. And a less confusing way of saying that is basically the type of deed will determine whether the grantor is liable for not actually having certain interests in the property, or basically certain rights to the property that the grantee could then go and sue for. As well as this, the type of deed determines the claims that another person can make or another entity can make against ownership of that property. Now, in the last part, I mentioned words of conveyance, and in words of conveyance, along with determining the type of deed, it also talks about the three possible covenants that the deed could be. Or should I say, which of the three covenants are being promised? Covenants are legally binding promises to the grantee who is receiving the piece of real estate, basically acting as a form of assurance to the grantee or receiver of the real estate. The first part is covenant of season. Now, I will say, side note, I didn't know how to say this at first. I thought it was like covenant of seasoning. But anyways, the covenant of season is basically the right to disposition. Now, the right to disposition is also one of the three bundles of rights that come with real property. And that is basically saying, I have the right to change my rights. If I want to allow someone else to use this land, or I want to sell this land, I have the ability to do that because it's within my rights to change, alter, and possibly even give away the rights to this land that I have. The second part is covenant against encumbrances. And it basically says that apart from any liens or assessments or some type of formal claim to the property legally, like such as a mortgage, that is listed on the deed, there is no other claim that could come out of nowhere and take away this property from you, that could take away your rights. It's basically an assurance that, unless otherwise stated, that this legal piece can take away your land, there's nothing hidden out there that could restrict your use of this land. And the third part is something that kind of is a bit questionable with real estate, which we'll get into here just because of how deeds are more so a piece of land rather than, or a piece of a title, or a piece of a claim rather than just the claim itself. But essentially, this part is covenant of quiet enjoyment. No one has a better claim to the title, which means essentially, while a deed alone isn't sole claim and proof of claim to a piece of land, this specific deed does show that you really have the best claim to the land, and no one else out there has a better part of their title that could restrict your rights or say that they have it or own it more so than you do. And a good way to look at it is Disney has the land, and they own the land to Disney World. I could get a deed, which we'll talk about. I could get a quit claim deed to the land, but ultimately, at the end of the day, historically and legally, I do not have nearly as good of a claim to Disneyland as the Walt Disney Company does to the land, and thus they have the rights to use the land because they have the top claim to the land. Now, the next part is the habendum. I think that's how you say it, at least. And this is arguably one of the most important parts of the deed because it conveys the actual interest or rights that you have. Now, the three main bundle of rights are the right to use the land for however you want to enjoy it, the right to disposition or to change your rights, as well as the right to exclusivity, which would be like locking out or keeping the land to yourself. Those are the three main bundle of rights, and they come in different shapes and sizes. They come in a lot of different forms, such as fee simple absolute, fee simple conditional, or tenancy for years, or periodic tenancy, which basically alter the estate, and that in that situation it's exclusive possession. But there are also position or types of ownership and interest where you don't have exclusive possession to the land, but you have the other two rights, such as an easement. And in this section, you basically have specific wording that helps you get an idea of what interests you actually have to this land. And it is because of this that having, say, a professional legal expert writing this is important. And actually, in some states, such as the state of Georgia, you have to have a legal expert write this document. The next part of a deed is the exceptions and reservations clause. This is basically a section of the deed that highlights restrictions or things that curb your rights and interest to the land, such as a deed restriction, which is very common in an HOA, for example, which says, oh, well, you have to have a professional lawn service, like care to your lawn, or, oh, you can't paint your walls a certain color. There are certain restrictions that people can impose on the land that can come from several places of interest, prior owners, or heirs to those owners, whoever wrote the deed restriction. It could be an easement, such as a utility easement or a driveway easement, which is where you allow someone to go through your land so that they can access their land. It's very common in landlocked pieces of property to have a driveway easement. But ultimately, easements, deed restrictions are things that curb / limit your rights to the land, or they limit the three bundles of rights to the land in some way, shape, or form. And that's what the exceptions and reservations clause essentially highlights. The next part is property descriptions. Now, property descriptions are really as simple as they sound. It's basically describing the land that is being given away in some way, shape, or form. Now, there are three different types of describing the property, which I'm not going to get into today because this is already being a pretty long video and I still need to practice more at doing these type of lectures, I would say. But the big thing you want to know is that they have to be unambiguous and enduring. And what that means is these descriptions have to be able to stand the test of time. I have to be able to go back or go forward in 200 years and say, okay, this is the same piece of land, and that could be saying, oh, it's between two rivers that look like this, or, oh, it's to the left of, this specific like post office or something. It has to be able to be identifiable, and whether that's latitudinally or descriptionally. So like meets and bounds, for example, have an exact, you basically start at a point and go left, right, up, down until you basically cover the entire perimeter of the property. Plat, lot, and block number property measuring, it uses a very complicated, or no, that's government rectangular surveys, which that one's like the longitudinal one where you have compasses. But number 2 and number 3 are very complicated and mathematical ways that have prevailed in modern times for measuring and describing property. Now, there's a reason that we don't use certain things like addresses, for example, because addresses are not enduring. They can change over time, especially depending on how property changes. And on the unambiguous part, this can actually be very difficult when considering older deeds to the land, especially for property that's hundreds of years old, because especially back in the day, there were a lot of situations where you would have land that was just described as, oh, you got to go up till you see this old oak tree, and then there's going to be a rock. In between the rock and the tree is where the property is. And obviously things like that can change over hundreds of years. So like your tree got cut down, who knows what rock it is, or say it was on an old road, 200 years later the road's not going to be good. So you have to be very specific in describing the land, which is where the unambiguous part comes from. The last two parts of a deed are acknowledgement and delivery. Acknowledgement basically says that the grantor acted voluntarily, and usually it requires a signature that needs to be notarized, as well as a witness to basically say, yes, the person who gave away their rights to this property or curbed their rights to this property in some form willingly meant to do that and intentionally did that. As for delivery, it's essentially saying not that the grantee has to receive it, but that there was an attempt made to deliver this and for the grantee to receive the property. An attempt, a verifiable intent has to be made. It has to be recorded. And this can be by directly giving the deed to like the receiver, such as like when signing off on a house, or it could be a situation where you give the deed to an attorney who then delivers it to the person in question. There are also situations where it wasn't official and the deed isn't considered official, such as if you find a deed that was meant for somebody and then you go and give the deed to that person. There was never an intent of delivery to the grantee at that point in time, which therefore invalidates the deed. One important point to mention before we move on is that when we get into different types of deeds, it's important to note that the grantor cannot grant any rights to the grantee in a deed that the grantor themselves does not have. So you can't give away rights that you don't yourself have because you don't have permission to do that from the past deeds and past people who own the land. As remember, property rights are enduring forever and they don't stop when someone dies. That person has rights till the end of time unless they use disposition to give away those rights. So now we're going to move on to the four main types of deeds. And the first type of deed is the general all-encompassing deed, and that's the general warranty deed. In the general warranty deed, a grantor is essentially defending the right to ownership in all forms of the land to the grantee. It essentially acts as an all-encompassing piece of assurance that this land is yours and you have the right to the land. It encompasses all three covenants, and it is generally the most quality, quote-unquote, type of deed. The second part is a special warranty deed, which is essentially a general warranty deed, but instead of the grantor defending the rights for the entire history of the land, the grantor is essentially telling the grantee that you have no claims against your interest to the land that would come from my time as an owner of the land. However, any time before I own the land, there could still be claims against your ownership and rights to the property. Now, this next piece of ownership is probably the most sneaky of them, not because it's necessarily wrong or illegitimate, but just because it's mainly meant to avoid personal liability of the person selling the land, and that is the deed of bargain and sale. And essentially what that says is, yes, you should have all the rights to this land, and there shouldn't really be any infringements upon it, but we're not going to make any promises just so if something does somehow happen, we don't get sued. The last kind of deed is the most common one. It is the quitclaim deed, which I mentioned earlier, and it's essentially a deed that doesn't make any promises about ownership or claims of ownership to the land. And this is used for a lot of different things, such as giving away complicated or controversial ownership to land, which may be ambiguous. Or it can also be an example as simply as saying, I don't know if I own this land, but if I do, you now have my rights to the property because I'm giving away my possible rights to this land. A quitclaim deed basically gives away rights to a grantee without guaranteeing that those rights are actually legitimately legally guaranteed. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention is that the deed is just one piece of evidence to real estate ownership. Real estate does not function like buying other pieces of property, such as personal property, for example, cars or furniture, in that there is definitive legal examples and proof that can be tied to one document. Because of the complicated history of real estate and the fact that property rights are eternal once you have them, depending on the type of ownership that is, it can be very complicated to distinctly say that you have rights X, Y, and Z, or that you have ownership claims X, Y, and Z to a piece of land. And because of that, a deed is just one part of the puzzle of proving that you own land. It is just one piece of the puzzle of your title, and a title is basically multiple proof of claims to real estate ownership. And I think that's one of the most important parts to get. I know this video was pretty new. It's been a long time since I've uploaded on this channel. This is just something that I made so that I could get some practice covering the topics, because I feel like a good way to learn is to educate, and this helped me a lot. With that being said, bye guys, and thank you for watching.